All right, so here we are now in chapter one, the rise of military robotics. As the title of the chapter suggests, it's a summary chapter. So it's going to give an overview of the emergence of military robotics. So how did we get to where we are today? So there's a lot of historical information in this chapter. I'm going to skip over some of it. I'll touch on the highlights, and we'll just have to let it go at that. Now, um, it's basically the story that autonomous weapons, they're really not all that new. They've been used in warfare for a long time now in various ways, especially over, shall we say, about the last 110-ish years. And so we shouldn't be thinking of something that we're, being confronted with something we have absolutely never seen before. As a matter of fact, for centuries, versions of autonomous weapons have been around. Now, like any weapon, autonomous weapons have had successes and failures, and but it does. The author is making the point that we're just really getting now to the point because of the efficiency of data processing in computers. So that has been the really the big leap ahead is the ability for computers to process so much information and so much faster than ever before that you're really going to get seriously autonomous weapons. And that's not been really available for until probably about the last 10 to 15 years. And okay, so in Socratic fashion, we're talking about robots. So before we talk more about them and say anything about them and draw conclusions about them, etc., in Socratic fashion, we say, what's a robot, right? Socrates was always big on, if you're going to talk about virtue and say, can you teach it? Well, first tell me what it is before you worry about whether or not you can teach it or whatnot. So before we do anything, let's talk a little bit about the term robot. Now, it's a relatively recent word, at least in English. So it's not a term that goes back centuries and centuries in English. From what I know, and the author points this out, is one of the earliest appearances of the word robot in English is in the context of literature, and it's in the context of a play written by a fellow named Karel Čapek, who was a playwright, lived 1880 to about 1938, and he wrote a play, RUR, or, which was short for, Rossum's Universal Robots. So that play was a big hit. It came out about 1920, and you can still find copies of the play. It's easy to get in cheap paperback copies, and of course, go on YouTube and look it up, and you can see various adaptations. And it is basically RUR, Rossum's Universal Robot, is a company that makes robots. And now, as I said, robot is a new word in English, roughly, from about the 20s. So robot in English as a term is about 100 years or so old. But it seems to have older roots in Slavic languages. And again, I'm not a specialist in this area, but it seems from what I've seen and pointed out, is that it comes from a term like robata, which has to do with forced servitude. So the whole idea of a robot is something that does labor, right? And we often use that kind of like robot in expression in ordinary English, doing something robotic. It's not really having a free will, but you're doing something usually for someone else. So it implies the notion of a kind of enforced servitude. All right, so what was going on? Well, Čapek in his play of Rossum's Universal Robots, as I said, it was a pretty big successful play. It was RUR was this company that produced workers. So it produced workers. So RUR, it was a company that mass produced these robots. So sometimes it's interchangeable with workers, right? Now, again, so you can see you can interpret this in slightly different ways, given the political and the economic situation of the teens and the 20s in Europe at the time and North America as well when Čapek was writing. So the worker or the robot was basically to have everything that a human does except for some properties. Namely, they would have the strength or more, the stamina of humans and all these kinds of things, some kind of intelligence to be able to do things, but they didn't have a soul. They didn't have the ability to love. They didn't have, if you don't like the word soul, I just mean that in a sense of, like feelings and capacity for love and compassion, empathy, tenderness, all that kind of stuff. Maybe even enjoying poetry and things like that. But they could do everything, especially they would be pressed into doing what humans didn't want to do, right? The whole idea of the forced servitude is doing stuff that we don't want to do, right? So that's the basic idea of it. And so once Rossum's Universal Robots, once this company puts its robots out on the market, it goes crazy, right? That is, everybody's asking for these robots. Yeah, I'll take a couple hundred of them and whatnot. So there becomes this, and you can see what it's. You can see this is arguably a kind of an analogy, but there becomes a robot trade, right? So that selling these robots. And then eventually, the robots they're actually kind of doing well, and you can see also where this is going. Well, as the robots start to take over lots of tasks that humans don't want to do, they start taking over in the larger sense of that term. Because, and think about it, and this was also, you find this a lot in science fiction novels galore on this, but it's always an interesting theme. Is the more of our duties that just because we don't like a duty, and then we say, oh, well, because I don't like it, I don't want to do it. It might be a good thing to keep doing it. As I can think of one, exercise. A lot of people don't like doing it, but it's a pretty good thing to do it and not farm it out to a robot. You can't have the robot go to the gym and work out for you or take that walk for you. So this idea of humans not wanting to do stuff and then farming it out to robots, the robots get better and better at doing it. Humans start losing the ability to do things. Given that I'm an old guy and I have a pre-internet brain, I remember, all kinds of things like telephone numbers and things like that. I had to know them, right? Because even when those little cell phones first came up, the little flip phones, right, you still had to punch the numbers in. But who remembers telephone numbers anymore? And people say, well, what for? And even, doing long division, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of certain skills that basically can be automated, right? Like, having a memory and chip in a phone or a part that easily remembers a phone number. You don't have to do it. So do you lose your ability? So that's the principle is that humans, humans start to atrophy. Not a cheery thought. But again, is this something that we have to take into account? Well, Chapek said, yeah, basically, yeah. So, and eventually, there's sort of a development, and you can read this as a development in robot evolution. And of course, they're becoming more and more sophisticated, but they're still being exploited. And so you can read this as a kind of sort of an allegory of the dehumanization of people by turning them into robots, so that Rossum's really the play is sort of like a commentary on capitalism. You can read it that way, that really that's what capitalism does, or big business, or whatever term you want to use. That's what it does to human beings. It turns them into these kinds of robots that just have to work, and they're just there to be exploited. And so the play can be read in a variety of ways, or it can be read as the emergence of something new. And so that's one of the delightful things about the play, is that it has a couple of different, at least perhaps more, a couple of different ways to read it. But for our purposes, reading it as the development of robots and the atrophying of human capacities is indeed a frightening one, an important one, and could be frightening if one doesn't take it seriously. And so the robots eventually, back to the story now, the robots realize after, that after they sort of rebelled, standard rebellion story, they rebel. And what happens is they're like, uh-oh, we basically killed pretty well everyone except for one. I'm not going to go into all the details and spoil the fun for you, but they realize that they've kind of killed their maker. So, yeah, there's the death of God kind of thing. They're very Nietzschean and very Sartrean stuff. Seems a little late for Nietzsche, a little early for Sartre, but still in that context of the death of God, that the robots went, oh, well, we kind of killed our maker. Now what do we do? And so their rebellion it comes about, but this sort of magical moment comes when a couple of robots, one is male, one's female, yeah, they're gendered, um, and they suddenly develop. There's this jump, this leap in robot evolution, where they can somehow move from mere robotic states into desires and love, and I don't remember if they start, writing poetry and tunes and things like that, but they find love. That they develop this ability to feel and love, and they go off into the sunset and supposedly to start a world, a new world. It's not, it's not entirely clear. Like, is this a rebirth? Like, are the robots, after they kind of killed all the bad humans off? Is there going to be the birth of a new and better world, so that the whole notion of working and society is better in the robot form? Is it sort of like a replacement hypothesis? Like, well, then, we kind of blew it. Humans goofed it up and built something like a robot, and the robots are going to get it right. So it's not really a rebirth; it's a new world. Or is this more to read it as a kind of metaphor about, might be connected with socialism or communism, that eventually, after the dehumanization of the worker, they'll rise up and there will be a rebirth of the human world. So again, read in different ways, which is just fine. Is it a story of rebirth, the new world, or rebirth of the old world, sorry, and a replacement with the new? So this idea of what's the takeaway from this? Well, the whole idea is that once you start mucking around with robots, it's pretty serious stuff. You could have a transformation or a rebirth of society, and there's probably a lot of truth in that, because we're not talking about just automating anything. We're talking about moving our way up, so to speak, and up I just mean metaphorically in terms of increasing complexity. Away from robots that just do straightforward, like, single tasks, to robots that do multiple tasks, and they're broadening their ability even to do their tasks in very different situations, increasing levels of autonomy. And what does the story say? Well, if you increase the levels of autonomy and make a serious image of ourselves in a machine, well, you're going to have serious consequences. So in that sense, there's probably much to this. All right, so let's get back to a little more philosophy here and get away from the literature stuff for a second. So, well, just one last note on the literature stuff. I mean, this idea of creating something that gets away on you, of course, that's as old as Genesis, and that goes way back, right? When in those old biblical stories, and you find it in lots of religions as well. But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God creates and gives human beings the power to think and choose, and well, that gets into trouble. So this whole idea of creating autonomy, right, is an old one of how it can backfire. And same thing in the Mary Shelley's great 1818 work, Frankenstein. Same idea. Lots of things are explored in that novel, but it is another exploration of the concept of the creation of autonomy, amongst other things. There's lots of stuff going on in that novel. Okay, so what's a robot, roughly? Remember, I mentioned in a previous video that you can have a look at some of these terms that are laid out, but in the glossary, that is, page 4 or 5, somewhere around there, have a look. The robot is a machine, so it's a non-biological entity. It's a machine, so it's going to be something constructed, artificially. It's going to have certain kinds of things that it can do, that it can sense, it can interact with, manipulate its environment. So wherever it is, it engages. So it's got the ability to engage with its environment. It's got to be, and not something that just reacts, like, if it detects something, it falls over or whatever. But if it detects something, it can do something. So there's a series of if-then steps, right? If this, then do that. And that can be iterated or repeated. So it's, in a sense, it has to be programmable. So it is going to, and those of you that have followed the stuff on Turing and Searle, we got to be careful about this. So it's, in a sense, it's going to be reproducing or imitating we can put that to the side for now because those are thorny issues, but it's something connected with thinking and sensing and acting. So it's doing a little bit more. Like it's engaging and it's acting with its environment and doing stuff. And it can exhibit some autonomy. So like just a remote controlled toy, right? That would have some, those are often sold as toy robots or whatever. And we use that term, oh, the little robot, I'm manipulating it. But in this sense, for our discussion, we want something a little, so we say in terms of autonomy, a couple levels up, right? Metaphorically speaking, it has some autonomy. It can act and react more or less on its own. So the question will be, how much is programmed in, and what can it escape its programming in any way? That will remain to be seen. But there's some sense that it can reproduce and do some of these things, and it has some sense of autonomy. All right. So then the next section deals with a bunch of current military, then about 2009 current military programs. You can have a look at that. But as mentioned, autonomous weapons goes back further than just 2009 or whatever. Back, as I said, to Chapek in the early teens and 20s, and back to the notion, the understanding of autonomy being created in Shelley's work, but it goes back a little earlier than that. So in the next video, I'll look at a little bit more history that's connected to the rise, and again, to fill in more of the gaps of the story that answers the question, how did we get here?